I would love to know more about the eurythmics stuff.
Right.
Is that an okay place to start with
Yeah.
everyone?
Yeah. I'll try because I don't know if this connects with you. Is that it's living in this sort of coherentist perspective where I'm trying to balance a whole series of concepts, the but then possibly not found it any particular place, right? But like picking up on this theme of resonance, right? I'm attracted to sort of Deleuze's notion that concepts themselves can resonate together, right? So I'm in my particular path through life is that I'm looking for these things that resonate, um, and constantly that's my filter, my sift, right?
Mm.
Okay, so sorry with that preamble.
Mm.
With that, how so is this notion of so where did I come from to get to the eurythmic stuff? Is notions around thing versus process, and the notion of what is it that we are talking, what are these entities that we're trying to examine and trying to understand. And so I did dabble in process philosophy a little bit, but not the but and communicating with some process philosophers just to get an infusion of that sort of perspective. And then that related to my interest in second order cybernetics, and particularly I'm sort of a big fan of von Forster and the biological computer laboratory. Um, and make, I guess, an amazing environment that I would have loved to have interacted with Hask and Ashby and and the various logicians that were there and Maturan and Varela and I think that so where am I going with this? That von Forster's sort of notion of the eigenform, right? That really we have patterns or processes that when we as observers engage with them, right, that there's this kind of reflective or reciprocal, recursive interaction that may stabilize, right? In that interaction, as us as observers, not external, you know, we're in there with the phenomena that we're interacting with,
Yeah.
and there's some sort of stabilization, and that becomes then what he has the nice form is like it's a token for an object, right? So that's the entity, right? So that's
So it's an object when you resonate with it in a way that finds some stable phase,
yeah, stable, yes, stable.
stable synchronization, and when you don't, it's not an object.
Well, then it will cease to be a coherent stable pattern, I guess, to the observer.
Yes.
Yes. And so there's notions of persistence and things there about, you know, whether how long that thing sticks around and whether, I guess as a function of the observer, we'll spot it or not. And I think this relates, I think Michael in
Well,
various,
it's another way of saying that it's an object to me, right?
yeah,
And if
that's
I
right.
can synchronize with it, it's an object to me. If I can't synchronize it, but you can, it's an object to you.
Mm.
So being an object or not is a relational thing.
Yeah. It's like Michael has told us, you recollected the science fiction story of the high density um, aliens who, they don't see human beings because we're just diffuse, right? or the rest of the matter, unless someone starts to say, oh, there might be a little pattern there or something. So it's very observer dependent. Okay, so then it's like, so I'm very, very attracted to that notion of eigenform. And then so the few emails I was bombarding Michael with every now and then was, this notion that how else has this been talked about? So there's this notion of the wave structure of matter that's from Milos Wolf, which is sort of view that the entities will like standing waves of in the solution of the sort of a 3D scalar wave equation. You can get this these standing waveforms, and that their work shows that they exhibit many of the properties of things that we in other terminology would call electrons, right? Or that
So the
they
property of a wave that it is a standing wave, we make that observer dependent because we can synchronize with it, right?
yeah, I mean, okay,
So
so
its standingness becomes relational as well.
yeah, although we have to acknowledge that when we step from the world of the second order cyberneticists, where we are recursively coupled with the world. In fact, we co-construct the environment, right? So there is no out there and there is no objectivity. Von Forster famously says objectivity is the delusion that observations can be made without an observer, right? But when we step into other frames of reference, that we may have a more sort of standard sort of out there kind of view of the world. So there might be the notion of the observer possibly goes away. And I think there is an undercurrent in this. What we're getting into is alternative interpretations of sort of quantum phenomena,
Mm-hmm.
alternative to the predominant, or if you like, or historically predominant Copenhagen type, you know, Niels Bohr-led interpretation, where the observer does come in, in that place. Right? But there is a sort of this is going somewhere, I hope, right, as we float around. So there's these interpretations that will put like these entities, right, that have these properties that, like waves or particles, right? So one interpretation that was in terms of these standing waves. What's nice is that the wave equation has the notion of outgoing waves, but also an equivalent solution of incoming waves, right? So you've got this notion that any entity is in reciprocal exchange, right? It's influencing what's
So
out there.
it has an internalized motion which produces waves going outwards, but you can also think of it as waves coming inwards which create the entity's motion.
Yeah, or which alternatively which create the entity, right? The entity
Yeah.
is, right?
The
Is
entity is the relationship between those two things. Yeah.
Yeah, which is a kind of wonderful to switch languages again, because I'm sort of interested in category theory through my sort of reading of Rosen over the years, which goes way back, and I'm no expert, but that notion that in categories you can sort of have sets or objects and mappings between them, but you can equally take that entity out, and it's described just by the mappings, right, that come into it, right? So it is whether you reify the entity itself,
Mhm.
or you think of just
The entity is nothing but what the entity does in relation to other things.
yeah,
Mm.
where the end where it might be a whole set of mappings, right, or waves. We can change our language accordingly. But again, that speaks to some sort of observer dependent spotting, right? That there may be in this flux, right, of interchange. There may be sort of points in that, whether we call them standing waves or we call them eigenforms or things, right? That sit there, right? Um, okay, so the eurythmic stuff. I mean, part of that was, at a certain point, in my life, I moved from the UK and academia into Portugal, and was looking for interesting places to interact with. And there's a eurythmic school in Lisbon led by Professor Crocker, who have picked up on the de Broglie-Bohm wave interpretation of quantum mechanics. So this goes right back to the early days of quantum theory. Again, I'm no historian, so just please, take this with a pinch of salt. That in those early days where people were looking for the meaning, right, of this new conception of matter and the quantum states, is that de Broglie did introduce his wave interpretation, right, of quantum mechanics, but got roundly suppressed at that time by Bohr and colleagues who were more senior, to the extent that he almost dropped the program and only picked it up later. This is my understanding. But in that we got the notion, right, that rather than this sort of complementarity principle of Bohr and that it's wave or particle depending on how you observe the entity. In the Broglie sort of formulations, my understanding is that you're both and, right? And that the waveform, right, will have a particular peak, which in the Lisbon school they call the acron. And for us, that particular peak you might sort of regard as like the particle entity, if you like. And then around it is this theta wave or pilot wave or carrier wave, depending on, it's called various things, right? Which is emanating from that. And so that's a guiding wave, and that the peak, right, follows the density of that pilot wave. So that when you are looking at tracking, right, the motion of this thing, what it will do is that the particle entity will be moving and guided by the pilot waves. And of course, when you've got interacting sets of these things, right, the waveforms or the guide forms start to interact and form all sorts of the waveforms get complex, right? And
the same acrons can either repel or attract depending on the
depending
phase
on
of the waves, right?
the waves, right, and the wave patterns of the destructive and destructive patterns
I
that
love that.
formed. Yeah. And there's a sort of equally, right, so they retain a history of previous interactions, such that the motion of the particle, of the acron-like particle, is informed by the previous history of those guiding waves and all of
So
the.
that would be the phase of the dynamics of its internal complexity is modified by that history, right?
Yeah, absolutely. So in some sense, the motion is a product, right, of all the previous interactions of that pilot wave with
Love it.
whatever.
So that would mean that electrons are not all the same, that you can scratch them and make them a bit different, right?
Well, I believe that, right?
Yeah.
In as much as for a long time I thought about this sort of degeneracy, this sort of assumption that all of these electrons are the same. And of course, if you construct your experiments to strip out and only observe completely context
Yeah.
independent
Yeah. You
things,
say if it doesn't do that, it's not an electron. All the electrons are the same.
now I don't know how much I've conveyed with my word picture. What's interesting about this wave interpretation of quantum mechanics is there are macroscopic analogs of it. If you come across these hydrodynamic quantum analogs,
Yeah.
yeah, um,
Brilliant.
yeah. So that means nothing like sort of an intuition pump, like being able to observe these things,
Mm.
and all sorts of quantum phenomena being reproduced.
Yeah.
Funnily,
I don't want to get us too distracted by it, but I saw that there was a paper by Bohr's grandson saying that the macroscopic hydrodynamics missed something important about real quantum effects. Is that something you include in them?
I'm not aware of that.
Okay, we'll come back to that.
Yeah. Well, I thought it might be of interest to you guys that, although I'm just going to sort of sketch, I suppose, or hint at the notion, some of the interpretations of the pilot wave. One of which is that it's really contains this sort of history or memory like effect, I suppose, if you like. And the other is there's a paper which I haven't really connected with yet, but become aware of, is that someone's been able to say something like that the structure of the pilot wave is Turing complete. So there's a kind of computational interpretation of the role of the pilot wave also. I thought that might be of interest to you. I've not dug into that yet.
Yeah, it doesn't mean that it's running an interesting program, but
No,
in principle,
but
it's
yeah, and it's a standard sort of framing that will get placed on moderately complex objects. That is it Turing complete, but it gives you some indication of, and again, from depending on which lens, I suppose, or which sort of set of tools you're using, you can get different insights into the phenomena. So that's, yeah.
Sorry, could I ask a question about this? And again, I don't mean to get stuck there, so feel free to move along to something else. But about this business with the electrons not all being the same. Couple of questions. What is the what do you think is the overall memory capacity of something like that? Right, like how many different scratches can you put on it?
Interesting. I guess I'm just heating it, Michael, here. I'm guessing it'll have something to do with there's got to be something related to the matching, right, of the intrinsic frequencies, I suppose, of the pilot wave phenomena, and whatever it is that's impinging upon that, right? It's to the extent that those two things will couple. And that must put a limit on the memory effect, I suppose, that's observable or relevant in a given context.
So this is super interesting to me because it ties into this polycomputing business that Josh Bongard and I have been talking about, in terms of, like, if a lot of the onus is on the observer to say what's going on, then the question of how much memory is in the thing itself becomes really weird, right? Because it's up to the nevertheless.
But I don't know that the question is well formed, right? So suppose I were to ask you how much memory can a rock hold, right? And I decided to use the rock's orientation on the table just by turning it around to mean different things. If I can discern 1,000 different orientations, 1,000 different bearings that it can point in, then it holds 1,000 different things. And if I can't discern that, then it doesn't. So even just one continuous value, if there is such a thing as a continuous value, can hold as much memory as you like. The tricky thing is that we want the information to be pseudo-discrete, quantized. And then the question becomes, how many different configurations are there, not just how many different values of a real valued number are there. And that makes it finite. But because of harmonics, it seems to me that the answer is, well, how deep do you want to dig, right? If you're able to discern higher frequency harmonics, then you'll find more configurational possibilities within it. But now you're moving in a sort of fractal or recursive space rather than a continuous space. But the answer is still as many as you are able to tune into is as much as you can get in it.
Yeah. So right, that makes sense. And so
I just made that up. Maybe Leo can tell us if it's true.
Well, no, I mean, I don't know about true, but it chimes to me that as the more that you start to live within a kind of relational worldview, or I won't say ontology, right? But the more you drift towards that, the more you start to realize that actually this whole idea of the properties being, placed within the object starts to shift to it's in the relation. That's what we're talking about.
Yes. It's
So
how deep can you, the answer to how much information can it hold is how deep can your relationship with it be?
yeah, well, yes, the degree of coupling, right, um, will be related to I guess the degree of information, or it will reveal different aspects, right?
Mm.
And so that I guess the richer the coupling, right, the more richness of the phenomena is brought forth.
Mm. So I would like to dig deeper on two particular directions. One is I'd like to know more about uh, connections to cognition that go beyond memory into territory of learning and adaptive behavior. And the other I would like to push on is relationships to biology. Perhaps we'll do that first. So it must have occurred to people that, well, to von Forster, I suppose, if no one else, that the acron that we're talking about in terms of the nature of matter and otherwise inanimate things also applies to uh, biological individuals, right?
Uh,
I'm an acron, you're an acron.
yeah, because I mean, so let's not conflate because I don't think von Forster was talking very much about electrons, although he did start with quantum. I don't know if Michael picked up, but von Forster's had a paper on the quantum mechanics of memory, I think, even before he came to the States. And I think that was his introduction to um, the Macy group. And um, so the one thing I appreciate about the von Forster sort of nucleus, right, that there's people around the work that they pushed, is that it was focused around biological systems, but of course, another one of my particular compass, right, is that one of the things that will guide me on my path is that there's a sort of continuity of the phenomena that we're talking about. I suppose it's sometimes called scale invariance or universality or something like that. The phenomena we're looking at is we're talking about the same principle, and they will manifest differently. And then, of course, science and disciplines have created different languages to talk about these things. But I'm always driven by the fact that's uncomfortable. It doesn't resonate with me that there are different types of phenomena, different languages at different levels, and that they are describing different kinds of realities or different kinds of rules. I'm happy that there are languages that at a certain level of abstraction give you a set of tools and things to talk about. But I'm always looking for something that sits below that, but will have that universality.
I'm simultaneously above it.
Yes, yeah, I mean, yeah, it's hard to get out of that spatially embedded metaphor, really. But, so sorry about that. So yes, so this, the whole, I mean, yeah, the notion of autopoiesis really came out that same scene, right? The recursive
Yeah.
interaction.
But what I
Yeah.
learned about autopoiesis uh, didn't seem to have the same acron theta wave kind of nature to it. Did I just not read enough?
No, because I did a poor job of separating those two. I was trying to give you some indication of, and I've conflated them, of different sort of influences that in me as a center of these things coming in is that I'm trying to make a coherence out of these, so that when I brought in the notion of the wave interpretation of quantum mechanics, that was for me, that's a domain where you could interpret that through the lens of the eigenform, right? That there is something, some entity that's that's persist has properties. Sorry, see, the language is really tricky and slippery when you start, I'm using words like properties and everything. That's just the way our language is constructed. But is that was a domain where I saw, well, there's an instantiation of the kind of thing that von Forster is talking about here, right? With the fact that what is it that we take to be an entity that we start to talk about? Where does that come from? That reciprocal coupling, that stabilization, and that. And so when I started to talk about the wave interpretation of quantum mechanics, that I just saw as a domain, well, okay, here's an instantiation, right? At a different level from what von Forster was talking about, because we're guided by what are these underlying principles, not what physical scale they might manifest at, right? But what's interesting is that in certain kinds of domains, right, so different kinds of salience and interpretations become evident. And then that's interesting, because then if you taking a more universalist sort of approach, you say, oh, well, that's interesting, because that's the language or interpretation that's taking place there. What does that mean in this other scale, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. So that was the dance I was trying to do.
So is it unusual to take a position where one views the organism as an acron that's a dynamical activity that produces a pilot wave that maintains its own activity, that maintains its own coherence as an object, and moreover a life cycle and its lineage as an oscillation that's bringing the organism into existence and then recreating the conditions for its own origination in the next life cycle. Is that sort of view of an organism part of this lens of the eigenform? Or is that just me?
No, okay, so when I respond to that, I don't remember from von Forster's writing that the notion of the reoccurrence of the eigenform, like the dissipation of it and the reoccurrence. Mm-hmm. That might be there, I don't remember that. But of course, if your cognitive apparatus, right, doesn't undergo any significant restructuring, right, in a given period of time, then it's going to be attuned, right? And if that phenomena is also of the same characteristic, you would expect, right, that if there was some decoupling at some point, then it might well easily reestablish itself, right? And then on some given cognitive clock, we might not notice that it had gone away and come back again.
Right. So when you tune into something so that you can perceive it as an object, that it's an object to you, that's another way of saying, I think of it at least, like saying, I'm going to look at it on a particular frequency where its orientation always looks the same to me, and I'm not going to look at it on the in-between phases where it was doing something else. So it's like I imagine it like a spinning object that I'm strobing at the right frequency so that it looks stationary to me. Right.
Okay. So when my initial response to that is there's like there are two different timescales going on here. One is like what is the inherent underlying cognitive processes that we don't control, which is giving us our experience of our experiences, right? And the other is the more intentional or attentive sort of mode of how I decide to look at something, which I think is also important, right?
Or how something gets my attention.
Yeah.
If I were to describe it passively.
Yeah. Okay. So that came to mind in response to what you were saying. The other thing I want to circle around back to, because you start off with this, is like what's the sort of scaling of this view of an entity, a wave-like entity, right, which may combine with others to form coherent structures. It's like, and then one would expect those sort of coherent structures to have their own waveforms, right? Guiding waveforms.
Yes, in a dimension, in a space with a dimensionality that the previous objects couldn't perceive.
Yes, there's a this is the sort of this becomes the part-whole relationship there, doesn't it? Right, which is those compositing entities, right, become the larger one, right? But the larger one then becomes yet another thing in relation to those, right?
Okay, good. So since we're talking about part wholes, let's talk about harmonics, because we've talked about resonance, but we didn't talk about harmonics yet, right?
Mm.
So if you're going to have some parts, they need to have frequencies you can see. And if there's going to be a whole, that needs to have frequencies you can see. And if that's not just a coincidence, then the frequencies of the parts need to fit into the frequency of the whole, right?
Well, to the extent that my nuance there would be when there's when there's an interaction to component parts to build something whole. Of course, we can talk about a build-up, or we could equally go in another direction. Yes.
Yeah.
Are they, can we assume that they're like atomic, right? Or in in their interaction, right? They are both changed. So that you're saying, I think you were sort of saying, is there preservation of the frequencies of these notional waveforms that start to combine that create a large object with its own harmonic, its own frequency sort of spectrum, I guess. Is that I'm not sure that we could necessarily say that it's this completely decomposable, right? That the frequency structure of those independent things are there. That feels a bit too like not
Yeah.
not not organ not non-linear, not
Right. So
not
the parts, if we do it bottom up
yes,
by
yes,
convention,
yes.
but from the sidelines admonishing ourselves for being so conventional about it, if we do it bottom up, then the parts in coming into contact and tuning into each other create I don't know how to say it, except a dance of back and forth between the two of them.
Yes.
That is an oscillation at a higher level of organization that they couldn't do on their own, right? Because it's a modulation. You're a modulation to what I'm doing, and I'm a modulation to what you're doing, and together that creates something that's a higher dimensional waveform than the waveform that either of the parts had. And in coming into contact in that way, in order for me to see you and for you to see me, we each need to adjust ourselves in such a way that we tune in, right? That we synchronize with each other. And that means that we've been changed by the contact, which is another way of saying each of us as we were doesn't quite exist anymore, that we've been transformed. But also in the process, we've created something new at a higher level of organization that wasn't there before. Now, one could imagine that it becomes a sort of total homogenization, that I don't exist at all anymore and you don't exist at all anymore. We've just become this greater thing, and our previous identities have been obliterated, like two balls of plasticine pushed together and become one ball of plasticine, and the old balls are gone. But organisms and cognitive entities things that have memory and can learn and shit like that. They're not like that, right? They're not homogeneous. They don't become homogenized. They don't lose entirely the component structure, but neither is it true that the components retain the entire independence that they had before, if they ever were. Instead, you have something where there's still something going on that maintains the identity of me, and there's still something going on that maintains the identity of you, and there's something going on between us that creates something new at a higher level organization. And for those three things to be true, the frequencies of my behavior and the frequency of the behavior of the whole must be in harmonic relationship.
Okay.
Yeah, they must have that musical relation, because otherwise one of the parts would be coherent but the whole wouldn't, or the whole would be coherent but the parts wouldn't. An observer wouldn't be able to see both of them if there wasn't a frequency that was common to both of them.
Well, the observer may see the whole, may choose like a, it's like a gestalt figure ground sort of, they may see the whole, or they may decide to focus on the parts,
Yes.
right? But they're
So,
not seeing both at the same time.
right. So it's like, can I hear an octave? Right? An octave is composed out of F and 2F. And I can, if an octave is playing, if that interval is playing, and I'm resonate to F, then I can see F, I can hear F. If I resonate to 2F, then I can hear 2F. 2F is there as well. But that's not really hearing the octave, right? It's in order to hear the octave, I also need to hear the relation between them. Relation between them is the difference tone. The difference tone wasn't there before, right? Between one frequency and another frequency, the difference tone between them is a new frequency that wasn't there before. If I can hear the difference tone as well, that's still not really it, right? What I really need to cognize is the word that comes to mind, is that the difference tone tells me about the relationship between the two other frequencies. It tells me about the phase change, the phase relationship between those two frequencies, even though two things at different frequencies don't have a fixed phase difference. It tells me about the nature of the phase relationship between them. And then I'm perceiving the octave. But in order for me to be able to do that, I have to be an octave. The only kind of thing that can perceive F and 2F and the relationship between them is another octave. I have to be a model of the thing that I am perceiving in order to see the whole and its parts and the relationship between them.
Yeah. I mean, that's a sort of, so that's taking your harmonic analogy, and that's reifying the more generalized version of the coupling between the observer and the observed. And what is the form of that coupling, right? And you're putting a model, you're putting an analogy on top of that, right? That it's the resonant relationships that take place. That is what the coupling, the resonance is the coupling that will bring forth, I guess, some experience or some knowledge of that interaction will bring forth something which will be that resonance, right? That experience. So what I was, so I, I'm really attracted, right, by the resonance as the mode of, as a form of a mode of coupling, right, which has lovely generalizability and scale spanning sort of properties, and to that extent, when you're articulating it through your talks, it was that one of those moments where you go silent because it's something you think, oh yeah, that makes, when you hear something that resonates, sorry, in the reflexive loop, right? Then it felt right. On but the question I might have coming back to you is that that good for, you were talking about the coherence that the would be formed from the resonating entities. So we get the frequency relationships. How are you accommodating the fact that in an organism, like a complex organism, if we say in the biological realm, is that you could have subsystems, right, or processes that might be decoupled, right, that might operate at inherent frequencies that might not be in harmonic relationship to
Mhm.
a whole.
Mhm.
Because if you go with the harmonic resonance all the way through, you're tied to a single set of coherence, which feels like a strong coupling. It doesn't allow for a decoupling.
Yes, it's like everything has to be in the same key. They're all built from the same
Yeah.
fundamental, otherwise they can never make contact with each
Okay,
other.
so what have you got
I
there?
think everything is built from the same fundamental. So in the polycomputing view, right, the idea that you could have two things going on in the same material substrate that are unrelated to one another. I think that, um,
That's a strong term, unrelated to.
yeah,
What? Yeah. So you mean is it not in resonance relation? Not in
I
a.
think that's what it means, right? So the only way that two frequencies cannot have any contact with each other mathematically is that they're in a rational ratio, that their ratio is irrational. But they're still that means that they're going to have contact with each other in the short term, because they might be quite close in frequency. But the effect that they have on each other at one moment in time, one period of time, will be the opposite of the effect that they have on each other in another period of time if you wait longer. So that then in the short term, it will appear like they're in contact with each other, but in the long term, they will undo each other's effects on each other's. But that would only be the only way that their effects don't accumulate in a way that add up over time or accumulate over time is if they were in a purely irrational ratio. Does that make sense?
Yeah, from that harmonic sort of perspective that
Yeah.
you
So I
you
think that the activities of the cells within a multicellular organism, for example, they can do stuff. This cell can be doing something with some morphogen concentrations, and this cell can be doing something with some bioelectric waves. And what they're doing appears to be sort of ships in the night that are not communicating with each other at all to first approximation. But because those cells are made out of the same stuff, that the kind of machinery they have inside, it shares a history, that means that the kind of tuning in that one of them can do has to be related to the kind of tuning in that another one can do. They can't really be singing in unrelated keys. And so their activities must eventually come back around in a way which accumulates and not just talks past each other forever. But
so
we knew that because
sorry.
that's why we were calling them cells in a multicellular organism and not just some cells.
So in your analogy, as an organism, I can't change key in my song, in the song of myself.
So I've given that a lot of thought. And it's a question I'm struggling with. I think that configurational changes in the arrangement of notes, shall we say, creates different tones that weren't there before in other configurations. And that means that in one configuration, I'm a thing and you can see me. And in another configuration, I'm not a thing and you can't see me, which is tantamount to saying that the profile of frequencies that I present to the world can change.
But then you need a mode of coupling which brings into play at the appropriate timing.
But that's the relation. The relation is just another frequency.
But then you're staying with the harmonic, the resonant mode coupling all the way through, right?
Yeah.
Because I'm wondering because I'm attracted, right? I'm attracted by it, but I'm wondering if it's too.
You're afraid of disappearing up your own orifice, aren't you? I'm worried about that.
No, there's too much of a lockstep. Right? Is that my feeling from my view of a complex biological entity at whatever scale is that you want to have subsystems that might run at their own tempo. That's not the same thing as you're saying, that there's frequency relationships, but you have to be careful in the time domain what we're talking about. Not that they can't. You need decisive action. You need things to take place at the right time, right? In response to some sort of context that we find ourselves in. So I need a way of allowing something to operate at its own intrinsic timescale, but when required, not to say that it's completely separated, right? So I'm absolutely buying there's some overall level of coherence that we're calling the entity, but within that, there may be you want a degree of loose coupling that allows for the quasi-autonomous nature of subsystems to operate, but then can be brought back into the whole necessarily, but not always in lockstep to some sort of overall, one fixed harmonic structure. This is my intuition, right? Is that there's something, there might be other modes of coupling that can play a role within, you could say that the harmonic one is the dominant one, it's very attractive, but is it the whole story to give you the complexity and the features that we're looking for?
Yeah. So one extreme is well, I'm an oscillation that's just driven by an internal driver, and I just can't change my frequency, and I just do what I do. You do what you do, and we don't really have any coupling at all.
You're entrained.
Another possibility is that I'm quite plastic in the way in which I respond to external influences, so that I don't really have a tempo of my own, right? I'm more like a shadow than I am like an agent. In between is the territory that's interesting, where I have a tendency to keep a tempo of my own, but at least my phase, if not the profile of frequencies that I display to the world, can be influenced by contact with others. But when that contact goes away, I hold on to it, right? So that it's like a memory. That could be done. I think that can be done. I'm trying to do it in a way where everything is a nice sort of circular rotation with everything's a nice circular rotation. But maybe it could be done with things that have interrupts and latent periods instead of things which are proper oscillations. There's things which are, rotate. I don't know how to say it except a rotational oscillation.
It's interesting that you use the interrupt, because I was thinking about some sort of prototypical model and that would capture the intuition that I'm pursuing about the need for quasi-autonomous subsystems which are coupled, but not necessarily through a sort of lockstep resonant form. And I thought about like a real-time operating system. It's terrible, you always use the analogies of the age that you live in, right? But where you get interrupts that might bring into play in the time, not in the frequency domain, which might give you the coherence of the submodule that you're calling on, but might be a time domain interrupt to bring that in.
Yeah.
And the job of the kernel, right, is to make sure that the necessary operations occur within the within the appropriate time windows, so that the overall process, that the controller is controlling,
Right.
gets to operate properly.
But it needs that latent period as well, which is like saying it's a time scale over which it can't be interrupted. So if I can be interrupted at any time, it's like I'm not really a thing. It's like I only do what you tell me to do, right?
Or I'm not able to respond on that time scale because it doesn't meet my own natural time scale. So I don't.
But if I was always responsive, that's a bit like saying, I am just you, right? You just tell me what to do. I'm just a puppet on a string, right? But if I at least have a latent period, that means that there are durations where I'm sensitive and durations where I'm not. And that's another way of saying there are durations where I'm doing my own thing, and there are durations when I'm being responsive. And that means that I'm bringing my own pattern of attention, and not just a sort of permanently interruptible cause and effect relationship. Does that make sense?
Yes.
Okay, so just to let you know, I'm going to have to go in about 2 minutes, but I don't want to cut this off. So if you're on a roll, I'm just going to leave this up as I go, but it's totally up to you.
Thanks, Mike.
Thank you, Mike.
How's your timeline, Leo?
I'm flex for a bit. Yeah.
Too.
Hmm. Were you making a point there about, well, one thing that, if we go back to this sort of interrupt sort of model, is that there's some intrinsic timescale of the sub process that you're calling upon, that you need to bring into play, and that will have its own inherent. That's possibly it has its own inherent timescale that you need to match or to meet in order to get productive. If you hit it too fast, it can't. It's not at its natural timescale. It may not even know that you're communicating with it because it doesn't have the capacity to receive that call for action or that.
That's right.
Yes.
I might go so far as to say that if you give it the same instruction but at the wrong time, it would have the opposite effect.
Right. Yeah. The timing is important. So is that distinction between the frequency domain coupling, which is dominant in your song approach, and the time domain postulating that bringing in the time domain, which might be a way of a phase relationship, right? Is when I ask for something, but not necessarily, they don't have to be in a resonant relationship. Does this make sense? This is the thing that I've been thinking that you might need that extra flexibility to build into the scheme of combining quasi autonomous but coordinated.
Yeah, I don't know what to think about it. I feel the same reluctance, caution, a potential problem that you raised there, of that if everything is a nice smooth rotation, like cogs with teeth that intermesh, it doesn't feel like it has enough flexibility to for subparts to have their own autonomy.
Oh, but surely the subparts are really subparts are any one of the entities that you're postulating, any one of the living entities. They're going to have that quality, right? So whether you start composing them into some higher order coordinated body, the same principles of coordination have to be taking place. That's my feeling, is that whatever we're talking about here is we don't escape it. We have to build it in
Yeah.
from the start, right?
Yeah.
And I agree with you. I didn't mean to, although it was the crude analogy of the operating system and everything, is that we still have to, is that when these systems couple, right, they're generating things which are not the sum of their parts, right? They are
Sure.
not, yeah. So that we still retain, right? But it was just an intuition that if there could be something which would allow for looser coupling, right? Because I think that's important for.
So when you turn it into an interrupt type system, that gives you the possibility of a sort of linear chain, that A happens before B and A causes B to happen. And that's a useful kind of causal structure to have. But
Doesn't have to be linear.
doesn't have to be linear.
You just
But
need a whole bunch of things to happen before something else happens. But the order in which they happen may not be important, but you just need to have
okay, it gives an order. Okay, it gives a partial ordering, but not necessarily a linearization. Okay, now the partial ordering is valuable because you can do things with feed-forward relationships that you can't do with symmetric relationships. But we're going to put this thing, whatever it is, this system of interrupts connected to one another, it has to, at some level of organization or another, become a cycle of activity and not just a one-shot thing. And that when it becomes a cycle of activity, the latency periods of those things is going to matter to whether it's able to bite its own tail or not. Right? Whether it creates a cycle that's self-sustaining or misses itself and peters out. And I kind of have the feeling that it will end up being like the system that we wanted to get away from because of that property, that it will that the periods of activity and latency will end up meshing in such a way that they create a higher level sustaining Kantian whole, or they won't, in which case it wasn't the kind of thing that we were interested in. And you can't really get away from that. It has to be a harmonic and it has to be in contact sort of conclusion, but it's not clear to me yet.
I see what you're saying, that if we are compositing recurrent structures, then each one of those will have some intrinsic timescale, right? Where as a whole it operates. Now the question, I suppose, I accept that, and then on top, but then is it necessary that recurrence is necessarily expressible as a harmonic oscillation? I understand what you mean. There's a closure there.
Yeah.
We can express that as an oscillation.
Yeah.
What I'm examining for myself is that necessarily the only way that can couple in then is through the harmonic relationship. That is the root of my question. For which, and all I'm doing is share, I think, sharing with you, because it's a very compelling sort of picture. So the first thing we want to do is break it, right?
Yeah, no, that's a great question.
Yeah.
Um, it articulates a concern which has been bubbling for me, and I don't quite know how to handle it because it does feel like the activities of living organisms are off, at least sometimes, more like an interrupt-based stimulus response sort of system, uh, rather than um, cycles within cycles, right? That are all sort of more orderly. Uh, I think there might be. I don't know how to resolve it, um, but you're right that that issue of closure is the thing that forces me away from that and back towards something which is harmonic. Um, but it's not completely satisfactory. The only uh, mm, chink of light I
Mm.
have there is I guess it's a way of imagining that how could something look like it's an interrupt system when it's really not, right? Uh, and that would be um, it would be when the observer uh, matched that kind of structure in an interesting way. Um, how does it go? I don't know if I can put it together because I don't know if it makes sense or not.
What what's coming to mind for me is because quite rightly you put the observer back into place, right? Um, so is that we're not just stuck in thinking about this hypothetical entity, but it's always in is that I feel like what we're kind of grasping at is like it hopefully in words that are congruent with your metaphor is like a mode selection,
Mode
right?
selection, yeah,
Modes,
maybe.
yeah. That how can we get different kinds of operating modes in relation to some different context,
Mm.
and uh, such that because I was thinking that in a particular context where the say observer observed or organism environment, which might be co-determining, co-constituent, but that's when that's established, and let's say sort of stable. Maybe at that point, um, a harmonic metaphor works because we're in a stable form of, of becoming at that point. What we're reciprocally related, right? We know how to move and know how to act, right? And
Yeah,
if something changes, something about the environmental context, some other third-party entity comes in or something, that there may be a disruption of that congruence, and we need to do a mode selection or shift to something else
yeah,
to be in good fit, right?
yeah.
Um, yeah.
I have the feeling that you could view a system which is purely harmonic, which doesn't have any of that kind of interrupt structure, but you could view it in a way that it looked like it had an interrupt structure,
Mm.
and then it would look like that there were events that came out of nowhere with consequences that dissipated away. And then you would then, oh, another event happens, and then there would be another cascade of consequences which dissipated away. And it would look like a system that wasn't conserved, but that was because we didn't see the whole picture. And if we were viewing the same system in a different way, we would see that all of that cascade of innumerable consequences that we were previously calling dissipation were just, they were a different part of a cycle which changed the pressure in such a way that it was recreating the conditions for its own origination of the event which started it all. And if it wasn't that to some observer, then like it just wouldn't be a thing, right? It would just be an event that happened with consequences that dissipated, and there's no point trying to make any sense of it because it doesn't, there's nothing to explain about it. Right? You can explain how A equals B and B equals C and C equals D, but that's the boring part, right? It's like the answer to but why was it there and why did it do that has to be because it was always there and it was always doing that, right? That's the only way to get away from that question, and that's because it is all part of one cycle where although there are many different threads of the melody, right? There are many different variants on the melody, and there are variations on a theme, and it looks like you get a different one each time, and that they are that they don't have any pattern or sequence to them. That just means you're observing something that's happening in a high dimensional space where you haven't grasped what the pattern is yet, right? And that's another way of saying you and the thing that you're looking at are not quite tuned in with each other, not quite synchronized, and you're drifting, right? So that not everything, some parts of what I'm looking at in the system are coherent, but not everything that I'm looking at in the system is coherent. And so they're drifting in a way that don't appear to be stationary. Maybe.
Well, it's made me think of there's a book of Varela's called Ethical Know-How, and in that he introduces the notion of micro worlds and micro identities, right? And from this notion of this sort of reciprocal creation of an entity in its environment, right? Is that so? The relation to ethics is that if we're in a given situation, a given context, and we are attuned to it, then we're attuned to it, then every action is a right action. So that every action is spontaneous and will generate, right, will be right or good, right, in the notion in an ethical context. And so that there's a match between the micro identity and what he terms the micro world. My memory serves me correctly. Now, should there be a shift in context to another micro world, what you require then is, first of all, you don't know how to act because you may not be attuned to it. Okay, it might be one that you visited, that you established in a relationship with before, but it may be presented with a new context. You don't know how to act, right? So you need to reconfigure, or I suppose deliberate, or choose a course of action for which you don't know, because you're not attuned yet. You don't know if that's the right thing to do.
Yeah.
And that would key into your notions of learning and these sorts of things. But you've got a multiplicity, right, of identities and micro worlds, and the micro worlds or key in. So where am I going with this? This is and you'll anticipate it, right? Is that extending from your metaphor is that we are songs. I'm thinking, are we song books, right? Or a song cycle. Song cycle sounds too strong and it sounds a bit linear, but you've got the idea that there's a repertoire, have a repertoire that I can bring forth in relation to a particular context, with the context being a relationship.
Uh-huh.
Yeah. And that doesn't really address, right, the question of what is the underlying sort of, so what I'm talking about is like micro-identity could be like the mode switch that we're talking about.
Yeah.
So and then I'm also thinking we don't have to choose between anything, right? Because both and might be appropriate here, right? That there might be both of these sorts of things taking place at the same time, and that's not a weakness, right? That's giving more options available, which is another good principle to operate on.
Yes.
Yeah.
Well, so that would raise the question: what's at stake by choosing between those views, right?
Yes.
What do you lose by taking one view over the other? And potentially, what do you lose by taking a both and position? Right? Is there something that you get from deciding one way or the other that you don't get from a multiplicity? Yeah. I think that there's something to do with being able to learn causal models as opposed to correlational models. Would require you to be a causal kind of system as opposed to a correlational kind of system. So one thing that I might lose by having the harmonic view, so there is no portfolio or catalog of songs that I choose as appropriate for a particular environment. There's just one big song. And in the environment that I'm in, which is one big song, my song plays out with all of the variations on the theme, responding to the variations on the theme of the environment in a essentially determined way that eventually will cycle around when the period of me and the period in the environment reaches whatever their lowest common denominator is, even though that might be very long. And so the thing that I might lose by doing that is that I might lose a truly causal model of what's going on in the world, because when you reduce everything to one big song, it's like saying you describe everything in terms of one big wave, and in the limit, it doesn't really have any time. It's just a shape, right? It's like it's a shape in the that's interminable. It doesn't have a beginning or an end. It doesn't change over time. It only changes over time because there is only time and there is only events with causes and effects to the extent that I haven't seen the whole picture yet, right? So if I go to that limit of everything's one big song, then I don't have any time and I don't have any events and I don't have any A causes B. I don't have any true causal structure. It's just a geometry. think I like that though. Yeah. Um, and so going the other way, if you allow it, it's not just one big song. There's a whole bunch of things going on, and A causes B and the rest of it. And in this context, I do that song, and in this context, I do that song. Then I have a causal model of the world where stuff happens and stuff responds to what happens. And there's a difference between A causes B and B causes A, and it's not just a geometry. But what I lose is the price of going in that direction is that that there isn't an overall sense to it, right? There isn't an overall symmetry to it. There isn't an overall reason for the prime mover, right? There would be a prime mover which doesn't have any reason, which erupts into the world, to use Tom Frose's language. Yeah. I think I'm coming around to your both end, actually. that both of those extremes um, uh, aren't where the juice is. That the juice is the juicy bit is in between somewhere.
Mm.
Mm. Nice. The can I had a couple of questions in my notes here from earlier that I'd like to follow up on whilst I remember what they mean.
Yes.
um, One of them was the process ontology versus material ontology. That's always struck me as uncomfortably dualist, that there's only two kinds of things. There's processes and there's materials. And am I right in thinking that the kind of territory that we're thinking about now is much more recursive than that? It's much more, that something which is a wave to me is a particle to you, and within that there are waves which are containing which are particles to a different frequency, so that it's not like there's an acron with its theta waves and that's the truth, because the acron is made of subacrons and the theta wave is part of an assembly which makes a greater acron and so on. Is that a normal way of thinking about things?
Um, to start with, I think that that notion that there's like a sort of substance sort of ontology or some sort of relational ontology or process ontology is that in given context, and back to our observer observed, it could be that in given context, right, an as if sort of approach might work, right, is that you can treat something as if it's this or as if it's that, and depending on your purposes and the context, that might be sufficient view to do the work you want to do. So again, it might not be something that you want to tie yourself. There's an underlying sort of metaphysical reality. Then there's the sort of um, uh, working models, right? That might be appropriate or not. That's the way I look
I
at
guess
it.
so I'm saying that the working model that I think is appropriate doesn't like the idea. I'm fine with saying that it isn't necessary to choose. It isn't necessary to choose purely a process ontology or purely a substance ontology. It's fine that it will be useful to treat it as if it's one in some circumstances, and it will be useful to treat it as if it's the other in other circumstances. My question is more about the sort of recursive, nested nature of all of this, that even if I were to treat things as a, I don't know, let's start with substance, I will inevitably end up in territory where there are weird relational things going on. And if I started in a relational way, I want to inevitably end up in a territory where there are weird substance-like things going on. And the whole thing is nested and recursive and fractal, and not just a duality between, substances and their relations.
And I think you're getting at the nature of sort of language in the sense that there's a recursive interaction taking place about which we may stabilize. We may stabilize on something we are coordinating about. And we may give that a token, right? And we may agree what that means. And that would be a notion of us, sort of recursively coming to some coordination about what the entity is that we are creating in that exchange. Yeah, I don't know if that helps, but it's to me that's because the notion of how the language, because I find this constantly, so I sort of, I'm very sympathetic, right, to having a relational process worldview. And I find that in my language, how do you express that without dropping always into sort of subject or predicate language, because that's the way it's structured. And there are different languages which have different sorts.
Yes, I can't help but say things like, wait, is this a relation or not? How many processes do I have, etc., right? So you can imagine that we start off with some thingies, and then we start talking about the relations between them, and then we notice that there's this kind of relation and there's that kind of relation. And so now those are things that we can refer to. So now the relationships are things. And they would say, oh, but what's how does this way of relating interact with that way of relating? We're just talking about a meta relationship and so on. But there's a way of short-circuiting, which seems initially counterproductive, right? So you say, well, there's the things and there's the relationships between them. And then you make the relationships into the things, and you say, well, what are the relationships between the things? It's the things that we used to call objects, right? Those are the relationships between the relations. One relation is related to another relation by the objects they relate on, right? So you're just turning the nodes and the edges of the graph back and forth.
The graph, yes.
Now, if you do that immediately, that you go from things to relations, then you call the relations things, and the things that were previously things become the relations. If you do that reversal too quickly, like with just one step forwards and one step back, it seems to have undone everything that was interesting about the distinction you were making in the first place, right? But more interesting is when you go through several levels of the hierarchy, so from things to relations to meta relations to meta meta relations to meta meta relations to meta meta relations, and then it becomes a thing, right? And then it folds back on itself after many levels of recursion, and that gives you space for more interesting shit to happen.
Yes,
right? That's the space of possibilities where we can talk about systems, not just bags of particles and not just fields, but we can talk about systems which have organizational structure, which which change over time, but without them being, hold on a second. Well, hello. I'm just on a call at the moment.
Okay, you have 5 minutes afterward.
Okay.
Yeah. What are you going to go?
Sorry?
What time can I go back? 3?
Got another call at 3. Shall I come and find you in 15 minutes?
Yeah.
Okay. Can you email me your room?
Sorry?
Can you email me your room?
Yeah, I mean, I do need, I need open space.
Okay.
Yeah.
Right. Sorry, Leo.
It's okay.
If you have those sort of multiple levels of meta, of multiple levels of relating, it creates a configurational space where you can have interesting systems. But often in computational ways of thinking about things, that sort of spins off to infinity in a way that never comes back. It doesn't have any closure.
Yeah.
And I think that the tricky but interesting thing, quality of biological systems, is that they sort of push out into this. They create a space of dimensionality where interesting configurations can happen, and yet they are also somehow contained, right? That they have a sort of closure that folds back so that things that look like they were linear chains don't go on forever, and they turn out to be cycles.
Yeah. And that things that are nominally very high dimensional actually behave in very low dimensional ways.
Yeah. So that it just becomes an aggregate, right? Yeah. It's like so Dennis Noble talks about the boundary conditions. So the constraints that come from below look like material properties, and the constraints that come from above look like universal constants.
Right. Yes.
But material properties and universal constants are actually connected to each other, right?
Yeah.
That there's a constraint on how those things are related, that you can't have these material properties if you didn't have those universal constants, right? I'm going to mention somebody else. Oh, Clifford. In your email, you mentioned Clifford. Is that Clifford as in Clifford Algebra?
I believe so, yes.
Huh. The plot thickens because when I came across Clifford Algebra, I was introduced to it from a beautiful geometric intuitive introduction from a guy called Steve Lecha, who also thinks about everything in terms of resonance. It's like in Clifford Algebra, every shape or form can be transformed into any other shape or form in the space of possible things within a particular geometry through some kind of rotation.
Right.
So there isn't really any configurational change. Everything is a rotation. And any rotation that you can do, if you do it enough, gets you back to where you started. Otherwise, it wouldn't be a rotation. And there's this notion of the pseudo-scalar where, the dimensionality of the form is pushed to the overflow of the dimensionality, that the maximum grade that you pre-decided you were going to use. And when that overflow happens, it becomes essentially a scalar again, like only a one-dimensional thing.
Okay.
Is that so that the Clifford Algebra territory felt to me, still does, like it has the right kind of mathematical structure to deal with the kinds of things that we want to talk about. And that notion of you were saying that the very high dimensional becomes like it's low dimensional again.
Yes.
I think that's the mathematical territory where Clifford Algebra gives you that.
Interesting.
Okay,